Hi there! Today we have the Fox of the Pyre from Ashes of Creation. It's a character that I thought would be very fun to try and model. I don't have much experience with this type of clay, but this is called polymer clay. I used the brand Sculpey. It seemed pretty straightforward. I saw a web artist, Jazza, so shout out to him, do this with a number of his projects, and it just seems like a great thing to give a shot to. With all of these types of projects, really what you need is just a sense of reference and shape and volume. If you can get an idea of what it is you're trying to make in terms of those base shapes, not just as a concept. If we say just a fox, that's very difficult. But when we actually look at the parts and we can see, oh, okay, we have circles for the hips and arch for the back, you can really take that across whichever type of medium that you want, whether it's art in terms of drawing or sculpting or other types of painting. So I start where basic steps with an armature. That's like a skeleton made out of wire. And then I bulk it out with some aluminum. It just kind of saves on the clay. The clay itself is a little bit heavy, especially in areas like the tail. We wouldn't want too much clay. I think it would probably bend down. And then you can see there a little bit of, that's like a felting, needle felting ball I put on the end. And we're going to try and simulate some flames on the tip of the tail with that. That art was an art supply recommended to me by the nice people who I spoke to at Michael's Crafts. Big shout out to them because I was looking for a type of animal stuffing and they pointed out that felting material, which was wonderful. So once we have our aluminum, I cover that in clay. Just kind of a base body shape here, not going into any details. Really just want to put that clay down for a sense of kind of the muscles and the layout, the volume of the fox. And we can always bake the clay again. And that's what I do to make a separate layer to put in more details. What you will notice here is that I'm just trying to get the actual pose down more than anything. And the pose really did come from the wires, but I have to bring it to life with the kind of musculature and little bits of angles from the clay. I want that head tilted. And so I bent the wire, but lining up the spine and everything is really going to make a big, big difference in our clay in terms of giving it that sense of character. I didn't want to just pose a fox just standing there, kind of like in my reference. I wanted it to have a little more character than that, so I had to use a little bit of imagination, and I think it turned out pretty well. Here you can see I'm sculpting the tail. I use more than one type of clay because the clay, again, it's quite heavy. I was worried about the tail being a weak point, but with very, very light clay, which I use later, that's not such a concern. There are other concerns, but not the weight. Here we have the feet coming in. Those were much more straightforward. Not too much to bulk out around there. Just try to get a sense of there's a bone or two in there. Hopefully it looks reminiscent of a foot. I think it does. Maybe not a perfect fox foot, but I wanted to leave some room in case we were going to put little flames coming out the back. Something I decided against. I thought it looked a little busy, but it's nice to leave a little adaptability in your model. You can see the tools I have here. These are the tools that were recommended to me. These are dental tools, can also work, but they were actually a very big help. I saw a kit that had over 20 tools. I bought that kit. I ended up using about 3 of them. But the ones that I used, I loved. They were very, very helpful. But if you do buy these kits, I don't think you need to get the one with a million different tools unless you know for a fact that there's certain ones you need to get. Here you can see I also did make a first bake of the clay, and then I added a second layer on top of that to put in those details. And through that, I could also kind of really buff out the figure, really get a sense of that volume. My fox was quite thin at the start. I didn't want it to look like a hungry coyote. I wanted it to look like a poofy, fluffy fox. So I think they're poofy and fluffy. I don't know. We'll wait to see them a little more in the game or whatnot. But I thought it looked good like this in any case, so I kind of tried to get it a little bit wider and poofier. And then tried to give it a sense of contour, I guess you would say, where the muscles go. After this, I'll try to experiment with some fur as well. But it is always a lot of fun just kind of shaping the clay around. It's very soft. With these clays, the more you work it, and by work I mean kind of handle it, the warmer it gets, and that really kind of melts the clay a little bit, and it gets very, very, very soft. So it gets to a point where it's almost too soft and you're a little nervous to touch it. And that's really what happens with the cheaper versions of these clays. The Sculpey especially is a very kind of entry-level considered clay. I have not used the others. I use Sculpey because it's cheap, and I happen to have a bunch of it laying around from other activities. But this one was something that if you do get it overly warmed, you can kind of toss it in the fridge for a minute. I heard to kind of stiffen it up. I just tried my best. I also tried to put in some fur pattern. It was a lot of work. I think it was fine as an undercoat, but it did not give me that poofy effect that I wanted at all. Kind of looked a little more like scales. So I wasn't fully happy with this first run, but then later on you'll see I tried a different approach to the fur that I liked a lot better and wasn't that much more work. This was very labor intensive to make these scales, so I know that if I ever make a dragon or a fish, I will have to take a lot of painkillers for my wrists. No opiate. So here you can see I'm trying a couple different tools just to get these little fur lines. I experimented with some things. Again, always good to kind of see what the tools you have are, but I almost always went back to my original tools. The trick with the clay is that when you're scraping or creating these lines for fur, it not just divides the clay and makes the line, it also scrapes and moves the clay, which means that little bits of clay come out, and then you don't want all these little teeny bits of extra discarded clay everywhere. And you try to smooth it down with your finger, because it's so malleable, it'll just blend it all back together. So it's a real balance. There are more professional grade clays. They're a bit more expensive, but they're much, much firmer. I did have some other clay that I didn't use. I think it's called Fimo. There's also a Primo. There's a couple of different ones. So you can always get some harder clay if that is more your style. But again, this clay is cheap, and I think it's great beginner clay. Here, you'll see I tried to make a fox's face. I think I did make a fairly okay fox's face. I used these plastic gems for sparkling eyes, and they melted in the oven. I thought that might happen. I hoped it wouldn't happen. And it didn't happen completely, but it was enough that they didn't look anywhere near good enough to leave just as is at the end, so I ended up putting some paint on them. But for now, it's great. And if you do want to make eyes with beads, which is a common practice, I think the better way to do it is to bake your own beads. You can do that with these other clay kits, or I don't know, there's probably other options out there. I'm new to this as well. If you have suggestions, I'm happy to hear. I'm not sure I'll be doing a lot more of these fox faces, but maybe there are other character faces that I can use and apply that to. You can also just make your own little round beads out of clay, bake them ahead of time, put them in there, and then paint the whole thing later. But that's not going to have that kind of clay sparkle effect. I think they have translucent clays, though, so that may be an option. There's a lot of stuff out there in the world of clay. With the fox's face, one thing to note, it's a little misproportioned intentionally because I still have to attach it to the body. And when I attach it to the body, I really want to make sure that I'm not kind of guessing ahead of time how much neck I'm going to need. I want to just put the head on the body and then fill in the neck as needed between it, which sounds pretty sensible to me. And then I promptly forget my own advice, and I begin putting in all these wonderful little details of fur on a neck that is far, far too thin. And I will realize that, and you will see that I end up having to redo a lot of my fur work because I've realized that my neck is the wrong proportion. So the typical art lesson here, start with general shapes and volumes first, details last. Don't start with your details. You will just be covering them back up when you make any correction. But it was fun and practice with the fur. Even though this fur took a long time, it was much more enjoyable to make than the fur where I was kind of digging into the clay. I didn't think that was nearly as nice an effect. The only trick with this fur when it came out is I wasn't sure how strong it was going to be. The clay did surprise me. It's quite sturdy, the fur. I haven't had any of it break off, even with some handling. A major benefit of the, what do they call it? The paints that I was using is that they have their own kind of rigidity and strength to them. And so those enamels, the enamel-based paint and just basic modeling paint, give it a lot more durability. And so I'm grateful for that too. And I put on a couple layers. So I think this fur, even though I use very kind of fine little particles sticking out, is actually going to be a good approach if I ever need something like that going forward. I think it looks really cool. Okay, so for the tail, tried something different for the tail. We tried a clay called Model Magic. That is a children's gauge is 3 and up type clay. You can't even make sharp spikes with it if you try. It's very round. It's very soft. It is an air dry clay that takes many days to dry. I literally had to sit this project down and just leave it for more than 3 days. It was about 3.5 days. It was frustrating to wait for it. I think maybe if you use a hairdryer, it'll go a little faster. I don't know. I wasn't going to sit there with a hairdryer for a day just to see. I would not recommend this clay. For kids, you can give it to kids, but you can't really use it the same as you would use other clay anyway, so it doesn't really teach that practical effect. But if a kid just wants to squeeze it, or if you want like a stress relief type thing to squeeze, then go for it. It's not that much cheaper than other clay, so there's no really huge advantage there. You'll notice the fox turns yellow at some point, and that's because I spray painted it. I would have wanted to include that in the clip. I did take a GoPro of that process, but it was just spinning all over the place, and it would have been nauseating to some people and not particularly informative. I'm sure everyone can imagine holding a can of spray paint to the fox. It takes no real talent or imagination. So I did that. The only thing to actually consider here, though, is what color. I went with a very light yellow, and I make some camera distance as well, so you can see better. But the reason I went with the bright yellow is because I wasn't sure when we take this paint how it's going to layer. Paints all work a little differently. We can't make assumptions. And so the clever thing to do is to test it out ahead of time. I'm far too impatient for that, so I just went right onto the fox with what I was sure would work, which is to put a light color down and then dark color on top of it, and leaving windows around the objects that I wanted to leave bright. It is very painstaking and laborious to do it in this style. It does work, but it was unnecessary because I could have just made it black. It ends up and painted with little white stripes over, or yellow stripes over it. So it was a lesson learned. Patience is a virtue. I was too excited to work on this, and hopefully you're excited to see how it turns out here. But make tests is the lesson here. I actually did make one test of the tail because certain spray paints can melt things like styrofoam. It's soluble. So in the what do they call it? I don't know. This is the same materials. So I was worried that the tail would actually melt when I spray painted it, and fortunately it did not. I guess it makes sense because then if it did, it probably wouldn't be non-toxic to eat. Styrofoam, not super healthy for you. So it worked out. But that is one thing I was nervous enough to actually make a separate bit and test it. I have a pile of foxtails I made with another pack of clay just to see what would happen with them with various media. After that, I had my fox dry so I could use some toothpicks and mixed up some paints, and I went back in and made those little fire effects. Now it looks 30% less like Pikachu. And those fire effects, I think, really had some nice depth to it. They took a little time to dry, and then they changed colors a little bit, but it was a good gradient, I think. To make sure that all your oranges and reds work together, all you have to do is take a dark color red that you want to go down to, mix it with your brightest color yellow, and just use shades of that throughout your whole fox. That way you're not trying to guess, well, is this color a little too orange? Is this one a little tan? Is this one more saturated or desaturated? If you're just picking out separate colors and adding them, there's a lot of matching that you have to do. But if you use your own gradient, you never have to worry about that. What you do have to worry about is the saturation of the color. If it's bright enough, you might want it more red, and it's hard to get those really vivid middle colors with just mixed colors. But I think it worked out pretty well. I am curious. I couldn't tell from the original design, and I did hybridize several stages of the production work. What direction do the flames go on the fox? They seem to almost kind of come up from the feet, I think. So I went with a little bit of that, but they also just seem to be or centered on themselves, where the flames are around like the center of the stripe and then kind of go outward towards the legs, or the edges rather. So I went generally with that aesthetic, but also a little bit where the floor, the ground was the hottest part, and kind of flames rose up from the feet. I hope that's what they had in mind, but it seems to have come out okay, so I'm pretty happy with it. The tail, I especially try to emphasize that some directionality in that. There was a question with the tail if I was going to make it look more magma-ish or fiery. One thing I did try to do is, again, use those needle felting materials to try and create those tufts of fur on the edge of the tail, and I think they came out really cool, so no regrets there. And that's about it. The fox is about done, and then we can see it all together. You can see it's quite a large model compared to the size of my hand, and I think it really shows something of the original intent in terms of how the design was made for the game. And once that fox is done, that was a massive success or feather in my cap achievement there. You can see I might actually try to add fix some eyes, but that was a huge step, and I was so happy that my fox was done. It's tempting when you finish a major step like that just to say, phew, I'm done, I finished my project. But I wanted to be a perfectionist. I wanted my saddle on the fox. I wanted this 100% to have all the assets and bells and whistles from the original. So let's make a saddle for this fox. I did make the back smooth purposely so that I could add something on top of it. So here you'll see I tried to just cut out a saddle. I used the same type of style using an armature ahead of time to measure the width of my fox. It's really important in this style that you have the exact right width, because I didn't model this onto the fox, obviously. This is a separate piece. If it's too wide, it'll just rattle around and look silly, and if it's too small, it won't fit, and the whole thing will be wasted. That was something that terrified me a little bit, so I tried to measure that out many times, and then I made a base saddle part and then a seat on top of that. And you can see those two pieces there, as well as a blanket. Most of that didn't end up working out for me. So you can see I put a saddle on, and then I tried to stack those things together, and I immediately realized it was far too tall. The guy would have just been on stilts on this fox. So I redid my saddle seat from scratch, combined as one piece. And that way, the seat is much more reasonably positioned. And I think it came out pretty nicely. After that, I made some saddlebags on the side. They have a core of aluminum just to keep them nice and light. And then I wrapped that in clay and just put a little flap on the top. And then, carved in a little bit of texture there, a little design. And these little saddlebags just add a little bit of character there. I'm sure that's why they were put in the original design, but I didn't want to miss out on that. And then you'll see I made some stands out of aluminum foil, and a couple of them I had saved over from a previous project with my Quarrior, another clay project I made. Painting the saddle. I went for a leathery look, and I think I achieved that. But when I put it on the fox, the color was all wrong. It's not that it didn't look like leather, but it was too orangey, too saturated, and it ended up clashing with the fire. It kind of detracted from it. The original design has a very dark saddle, kind of has a goldish gray with black look, and I should have measured that more carefully. I didn't, but I will go back and fix that. It just takes me a bunch of time. I don't think I did all of that on camera because I was rushing before the paint dried. But here you can see the final design. It's more glossy and more dark, and I think it looks great. And then I go and try and put on the accents. The original seemed to have more of a kind of a Celtic cross type of design, which looked lovely, but I was drawing here with a toothpick. So there's only so much I can do. I think I made do with what I had, and I think it looked pretty nice. And here I'm mixing some colors around to get that exact sort of metallic look that I want for that brassy look, rather than something like just like a sharp gold, which is going to be a little too much, I think. So I mix everything up, I paint everything together, and I have a blanket there too that's supposed to go under the fox. Blanket I had 3 takes on. Did not fit under the saddle quite properly, but we got one that worked. And then before I actually put the saddle on, while the saddle was drying here, I paint another coat of gray paint on the fox to really emphasize that fur, give it just some streaks in the fur, and I think it came out really nice. It really has more depth to it now, and doesn't make the saddle look so out of place in terms of the composition. So very happy with how that turned out. Then we want some other straps and things for our fox. I tried to use the original fox as a reference, but it's so dark it's very hard to see. So I'm not really sure exactly how a fox head would compare to a horse's for these type of things, but I just went back and used something a little bit more similar to what a horse would have, and then used some of the design elements from the original fox picture that I could see for sure. I used a lot of knots. If you slow this down, you may see some frames where I'm trying to use hot glue. I did use a lot of hot glue. I did try some saddles that did not work using the hot glue, and they were discarded. But after a couple hours, I did get this all together with the rope in a way that I thought looked really good. All right, that's about it. Thank you very much. Have a great day.